Well, it's indeed a pleasure to be asked. This is just great. And, when you get old, you're always glad to have somebody to talk to. All right. No, Barbara Bailey just told me a few minutes ago that I should tell everybody that, no, I'm not 84 years old, I'm 21. All right, my name is Denny Virgealia Looney. I was born February the 29th, 1928. The hospital, Marsh Clinic, is anybody here as old as I? All right. All right, you might remember where Marsh Clinic was. It was at the going around the church circle, and just before you get to First Baptist Church, there's a little street that goes right up beside First Baptist Church at the circle. Marsh Clinic sat right on that, across the street from First Baptist Church. I lived at RFD 3, Church Hill, Tennessee, Rotherwood. My telephone number was 21. Tonight, it seems like I'm just bubbling over with thoughts that I want to share with you. There's so much joy, and that's the best word that I can use. So much joy in thinking about Kingsport. I feel like that I am really a model city child. And if any of you know what model city is, we just have a different attitude than people who just come in and we call them foreigners, not from the model city. And I hope this evening, as I talk, and I don't have but 30 minutes, gosh. As I talk, I hope that from the joy in my heart and what I say with my tongue, that it will be a pencil for you to use in recording my thoughts that I have, to me, are truths. I want to center my time this time, my thoughts, on Mr. John Bartlett Dennis and Mrs. Lola Anderson Dennis. You know, I talk about Rotherwood so much, and Tom is here, and Tom lived in Rotherwood too. But I just think we don't know enough. Can you hear me without this mic? Yeah. All right, yeah. We just don't know enough about Mr. John B. Dennis. And when his mausoleum and Mrs. Dennis, when their mausoleum was cleaned over at our city cemetery, and we celebrated that here, the mausoleum of John B. and his wife Lola. Here it is right here at the cemetery, and most of us didn't even know that they had a mausoleum. So there was a celebration in the early spring that it was cleaned off. And now you can see it. The brush is gone. It's been landscaped, and all of the work around the entrance, you can see it. And his niece came to Kingsport. City of Kingsport invited her to come to Kingsport to see where her uncle had lived and put his time and his energy. And she says, I've never been here. I knew I had an Uncle John, but I've never been here. I am so surprised. I'm just filled up knowing that Here I had an uncle, and I did not know that he had almost founded a city, and people have respected him, and they want to honor him. All of a sudden, I said, I have to go back, dig, look, find, remember about Mr. John B. Dennis and Miss Lola. Mr. Dennis was a quiet man. I have a picture over there. That was the program to celebrate the cleaning of the mausoleum. He looked very much like that. Mr. Dennis was born March the 4th, 1866. He was born in Maine. His father was a freighter, not a freighter, shipper. He was a shipper. And at that time, the people in Maine and Massachusetts, that was their occupation. They shipped goods out to the southern islands or over to Europe because they could ship easier because they had ice. And ice was free all the time. During the wintertime, there was just ice everywhere. And when they wanted to send molasses or anything else or perishable goods, most of these people could not send anything because there was no ice then. Nobody knew about refrigeration. So a lot of stuff that was perishable, it perished. So John B.'s daddy found out, hey, we can make some money. We have ice here all the time, all the way around everywhere. So they got straw, they baled it, they packed it, and they were able to ship things even to Jamaica and to the islands. Now, that's where his daddy got his money. Now, originally, I understand that Mr. Dennis came from England, and they settled in Maine or Massachusetts one. But it's his daddy that got him started. John B. Dennis was the oldest child, oldest son out of 4. He was very quiet. He didn't do well in school socially. He didn't like sports. He wanted to go dressed up all the time. He didn't make friends very easily. He wasn't really social. But this is one thing that made him stand out and shaped his life. I have a saying, discipline defines your destiny. And because he was so disciplined, when he was a child, it actually defined his destiny up to the time that he passed. His father then was so much into ice that he owned an ice house. So John B. decided that, you know, he has a whole lot of men working there, and they might need a smoke. So he went down to the corner store and bought some 5-cent cigars, put them in a box, walked down to his daddy's ice house, and the man would say, "What you got there, son?" He said, "I got a cigar, 10 cents a piece." They bought the cigars. So when he would count up his money, he had quite a bit because he was charging those cigars getting double out of those cigars. So one of his little friends found out, well, you know, why can't you play? Why can't you come out and do something with us? He said, "No, I'm busy. I got to work." So the little boy finally, his friend who would talk to him said, "You must be making a whole lot of money. You have double money." And he said, "Well, I got to go to the store and I got to buy the cigars. I got to find a box and I got to put the cigars in the box. Then I've got to go to the ice house to the men, and I have to stand there and sell it to them. And then I have to come back home. So when you take all of that off of there, I haven't made but 7 cents off of my cigars. Even at that age, he realized how he was making money. Well, his daddy found out that his little son was coming to the ice house selling cigars to the men that worked. And his daddy said, oh, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. Why? My men will make so much money, they'll spend all the money they make on your cigars and they'll quit, or either they'll want more money. Get away. You can't do that anymore. But that's where he started. That was his discipline and knowing what to do, how to do it, and to make money. He went to Cornell University, stayed 3 years. I told you he wasn't social. He was, according to our heights now, he wasn't a very tall man. He was slight. He didn't have a belly. He was just a nice-looking, firm, dignified man. But it was something about his eyes. You would say at first that his eyes were watery, but they weren't. Sometimes he would just sit. He would allow me to come in his study, his library and his study, and he would say, that's all. I knew he wanted me to be quiet. I could sit there, but he didn't want me to say anything because he was thinking. Now, Mr. Dennis worked for security and trade in New York, Blair and Company. I used to hear my dad come in. My dad was the butler, and he would come in because Mr. Dennis had an earphone. He didn't hear very well. My dad would say, Mr. Dennis, New York calling. And that was the Blair Securities calling from New York to tell him how the stock market was going, what was high and what was low. I never did see Mr. Dennis with money. He never wrote a check. But when he would leave, I didn't tell you that they had a second home, and it was in Oyster Bay, New York. Now, what had happened when Mr. Dennis worked at Blair and Company, he was so smart with numbers, and he would sit and think through any problem by step, by step, by step. And within 3 years, he was right along with the man who owned the whole security agency, the banking system. At that time, there was a lot of land that it was land grant money, and I'm talking about 1866, back in that time, and 70s and 80s and 90s, and people would buy just acres and acres of land, especially Virginians, because, you know, Virginia, the state of Virginia had their own currency, you know, so they could buy anything down south, North Carolina, South Carolina, or anything. Anyway, some of this land that some guy in Virginia had bought, about 6,000 acres, they said that, well, there's a guy who wants to buy this down in Tennessee and Virginia. We'll sell these 6,000 acres. All right. They contacted Blair and Company and asked for a representative to come and help them organize, check this land out, give them structure as to how they should govern and take care of this land. And of course, it was in Southwest Virginia and Upper East Tennessee, all the way down past Rogersville, all of this area up in here, 6,000 some acres. And some of it belonged to Mr. Carter. Everybody knows the Carter name over there in Southwest Virginia from that family. But when he came, they sent him with something else to do. Tennessee was beginning to organize and become a state that had some purpose, not only just the mountains and the rivers and the streams. Those people in Tennessee in that tract of land want to organize. You're smart, you know numbers, you have studied. And by the way, he loved geography, he loved science, you know, all that type of stuff. He read. He would give me books, read, you know. He believed in knowing what was going on. So while he was down this way and looking at what he could do with this 6,000 acres, he went on to Nashville, Tennessee. And he met with the representatives and people who were in the State Department and the governor at that time. I can't think of the name of the governor. But he helped organize laws, financial structure for the finance of the state of Tennessee. Now, knowing that, and then being given the opportunity to come here and take care of the 6,000 and some acres that he got out of Virginia, Mr. Dennis knew this area. He knew that it was a great vision. He was a visionary. He said, if I could just get some of this natural resource out of these mountains, out of these hills. And you notice those of us who are here, and we've been here for 2 generations or more, I don't know whether you have realized how many times Clinch is used. Clinch, you know, Clinch River, Clinch Port, Clinch Mountains. We're full of clinch, and we don't pay any attention to it. Now we got that big stretch of Clinch Mountain down between Morristown and Rogersville. We have Melungeons that live way up there in that mountainous part of Clinch Mountain, which is part of the Blue Ridge Parkway, the Blue Ridge stretch of mountain chain, which is part of Appalachian mountain chain. Free land, not free, but virgin land. Mr. Dennis said, if I could get that natural resource out of Southwest Virginia and got that property from old Mr. Carter over there, I could have a railroad. There was no link between the West and the East Coast. They couldn't get any goods out. We had mountains, we had rivers. Only thing Kingsport had to brag about was a river. A Holston, the North Fork and the South Fork River, that's all we had. And we would float logs down, rafts down. Even when I was a little girl at Rotherwood, I used to see the rafts come by. I was sitting up there on the porch watching the old rafts come on down the river. If there was a good flow of water, then they had a good time. They were standing on them and paddling and flying on down the river. So we had the river. When he came to Kingsport and had the opportunity to divide up that land, now I'm talking about 1901 now, and railroads were just coming through. The Industrial Revolution was just getting ready to power up. Everybody wanted a big smokestack and have goods to sell and run and everything. So he bought about half of that land. Now at that time, J. Fred Johnson was running the UNACA. Anybody know anything about UNACA? UNACA? All right, there was an organization in Kingsport, the forerunner of Kingsport Improvement Company. So it was called the UNACA Corporation. And J. Fred Johnson was head of that. And of course, J. Fred was from Southwest Virginia. And he met Mr. Dennis, and they became friends because they had something in common. You know, J. Fred was looking for something too. they formed this organization here. We got to use something. We got to do something because Kingsport can do it. We had little old Kingsport down there, but every time we get a little town, there was Rossville, there was Christiansburg, and everything. It would fold under, you know, something would happen. So they formed a Unaka company right here in what is now Kingsport. And he and Mr. Dennis got together. So Mr. J. Fred Johnson said, well, I tell you what, we'll ask your company, Blair and Company, to see if they would give us money to buy this 6,000 some acres, and we'll have enough land to have a town, and then we can have this other part that's in Hawkins County. So he said we can have Hawkins County and have something in Hawkins County, and then because this Unaka company is trying to build a town that will stick together. So Mr. Dennis said, all right. Then the Unaka company dissolved, and they call themselves now Kingsport Improvement Company. So it was made up of the few men that were here. Most of them were in old Kingsport. Showalters, Hubbard, Cloud. Those are some of the old names. Anybody remember old Kingsport? You know, if you drive on Netherland Road, you'll see some buildings that look like there might have been a store. You know, that was where Rotherwood Post Office, I remember that. That's where the post office was, you know, after we got RFD free, rural free delivery. Then before that, we had to go up to those little old stores right where the bridge is to go to Ridgefields, then go down just a little bit past between the bridge and Netherland Inn. You can see some little raggedy, tore down, buildings still standing. All right, that was the business area for Kingsport. There was a little post office there, and the Showalters, Mr. Nick Showalter's daddy had a store there. And when we had J. Fred Johnson, before we had J. Fred Johnson's store, big store, it was a big store, then the Kingsport Improvement Company hired one of the men that was in old Mr. Showalter's store there in an old Kingsport. Anyway, because I don't have 30 minutes, I've used it. After Mr. Dennis got the money and bought the land, then he started courting folk to bring their industry to Kingsport. Now, when he laid his plan out to the Kingsport Improvement Company, then they said, all right, we will give you the money, and we're going to buy Rotherwood, because Rotherwood by that time was dilapidated. I wanted to tell you all the people who had lived at Rotherwood, but I can't do that. But anyway, by this time, after Joshua Phipps, they kind of cleaned it up, and J.W. Dobbins, Dobbins Bennett's named after J.W. Dobbins, all right? Anyway, he was there in the house. So Kingsport Improvement Company said, we're going to buy this place. All right, in the meantime, Mr. Dennis, you know, he went to school in New York City, and he graduated from Columbia University. So he met a Dr. Nolan there, and Dr. Nolan was so excited about the vision of this young man. He wants to build a city, and he wants, because he was in the finance of getting this state together, and he knew that Upper East Tennessee had more than anything else in the state of Tennessee. He said, this is where I want to be, because we got water, we got everything that we need to be, and people. Got the money, they bought Rotherwood. Mr. Nolan came down. Well, he didn't come down. After he modeled the city, Mr. Dennis told him what he wanted. He made it like a wheel, a wagon wheel. The church circle was the inner part of the wheel. And from the church circle, all of the streets radiated from that center. The residential area was planned. The industrial area was planned. The business area was planned. All from that center circle. It was planned in 3 different ways. So while Mr. Dennis worked on the train, trying to get, the only train that we had was the one in Knoxville. What is that one? Nashville and whatever that train is in Nashville. And that's as far as the train went. We didn't have any trains up here. And he combined and talked to someone in Cincinnati, the Cincinnati and Ohio tracks and fundamental part was already laid, but they didn't have the money. So Mr. Dennis put his energy in getting the Cincinnati, the Clinchfield, Cincinnati, and Ohio railroad track. That at that time was the most difficult, expensive engineering project I think that the railroad industry had ever experienced. Nobody had gone through slate, blasting out rock. And before you could get to Irving, that train went all the way to Spartanburg. Before you could get to Irving, you had this just bed of rock. It was blasted through. It went all the way up to Kentucky because he had to get that coal out of Kentucky. When he got the coal out of Virginia, Mr. Dennis was president of the first coal mine in Virginia, Southwest Virginia. Got that coal out. After he got the coal running, he had that train running from Kentucky to Duffield. And the man who helped him at that time, now I'm talking about 1907 now, about 1907, his name was Duffield. And then Duffield's named after him. So, it's just fascinating. You can go and you can search and you can talk to somebody. Oh, yeah, we know because, so-and-so, that's his money or that's his family. Anyway, they got that train station in Duffield. And then he finally got that from Elkhorn, Kentucky, all the way down to Kingsport. Kingsport didn't have a train station, but they got that railroad laid and had the railroad station in Kingsport, and it was a boxcar. And I had some pictures, and I found that picture of Mr. Dennis standing next to the boxcar in Kingsport, right there where it is, where the railroad station is now. He said, now we have us a railroad in Kingsport. He courted Mr. Eastman. Eastman said, I'm not coming down there, but he married Miss Lola. I got to go back. Mr. Nolan, the man who designed Kingsport, where all the spokes and the residential houses and everything, they planted trees and flowers and everything to make it beautiful because this was a model city. There wasn't any city in the South that could equal this little city that dreamed in somebody's mind and had money to finance it, So when Mr. Nolan, they said it was about 1927 or 26. They were still working hard and getting this Kingsport together. All the trees and flowers died for this beautiful little city. So they said, well, something's wrong. All of this is in the plan because they put it out on the table, had little model houses and little model railroads and stuff. So it would be just a perfect place. So they said, we got to get us a horticulturist or something in here to see what's happened here, because anything ought to grow here. So somebody they sent out, and the application came in. L.A. Anderson. And graduated from Cornell University, architectural engineer. And at the same time, Kingsport High School was built right up there in the church, from the church circle, and it was standing where the Presbyterian Church is now. There was Kingsport High School. We had two women that come to town at the same time. The woman that Mr. J. Fred Johnson married, see, Mr. J. Fred hadn't married, and Mr. Dennis hadn't married. By then, those men were about 50 years old, but they were busy making money and trying to, get something done. Well, they brought in a teacher for Kingsport High School, and Mr. J. Fred was kindly, looking at her, nice-looking woman, black hair and everything. And when the person came into Kingsport Improvement Company to accept the position as an engineer in horticulture, it was a woman. And they had no idea, a woman engineer? And that was Miss Lola. All right. We had two old bachelors. And we had two women that were unmarried, not married. And the men, by that time, had reached about 50, 51, 52. They were pretty old, too, But everybody, I understand. Tom, have you heard that story? Well, anyway, the people who worked for Kingsport Improvement Company, even old Miss Paff. Does anybody know Miss Paff? She was Miss Paff was the secretary for Kingsport Improvement Company. And if you'd go in there to get your check, my daddy would have to go in and get his check, But what are you doing? All right, here it is. And I don't think she liked children. I would go in with Daddy when he would go to get his check, and I would peep up over her desk and put my hands there. Get your hands off. I can always hear that woman say, get your hands off. Get your hands off. Get back. Get back. Get back. But anyway, everybody was, and I was saying even Miss Paff was trying to get these two bachelors who were running Kingsport and these two women who were assisting to get married. Well, sure enough, by 1928, they married. Mr. Dennis married Miss Lola, and Mr. J. Fred Johnson married Miss, I think, Elizabeth Doggett. About the same time for the two. All right, my mother and dad came here in 1925, and they were working for Kingsport Improvement Company. I know my 30 minutes stuff. They were working for Kingsport Improvement Company, and they needed somebody to manage Rotherwood because they were building Rotherwood as a country club, to receive all of these men and industrialists to set up business here in this fertile place. So my mother was born in Stoneacre, Virginia, in Wise County. My daddy came from Hawkins County, Burgoynesville, and the little place where the colored people lived was called Zion's Hill. Well, farming got kind of slow down in Hawkins County, but the mines were going fast. They were going hot and heady. So my daddy and his cousin went to Stoneacre, Virginia to work in the mines. And they had to board. They had boarding houses, so they boarded at my mama's house. So my cousin fell in love with a sister. My daddy fell in love with the other sister. So they married. And they found out that Kingsport was needing colored people to work in these big people's homes. They were coming from New York City and Massachusetts and all around. So Mama signed up. Daddy signed up. My auntie, some of you know my auntie who lived to be 103. She and her husband, Uncle Tal, signed up, so they came to Kingsport. Mr. Dennis knew the president of Borden Mills up in Maine, Massachusetts. So he said, come on down here. We got water, we got everything. Come on down here, set up a mill. People will be glad to work. They entertained him at Rotherwood. And of course, they courted him very royally. There were only two people who owned Rotherwood that had a magnificent, glorious, romantic, fabulous house. That was Ross, and that was Dennis. Miss Lola ordered chandeliers from Austria. All of her rugs were Oriental. The finest, I brought here with me some of the things, and they're not the goodies, but some of the things that she had, the linen. Mrs. Dennis said, I know why the flowers don't grow and the trees don't live. You have the wrong plants. They won't grow. The plants that you set here and the flowers, they won't grow in this temperature. They won't grow here. So she decided to bring in walnut trees, cherry trees, maple trees, spruce, pine, all of the fruit-bearing trees. Now you notice some of the names that I called, our streets have those same names. I lived on Walnut Street. Of course, we got so uppity, we changed it to Avenue, Sevier Avenue. But I still have 2 walnut trees in my yard. Let me tell you about serendipity, and I've got to through. I have to finish because my time is up. When Fred Ross came here, when his father had given him through a land grant all of this property down here, and he came down here, only thing he didn't want to farm. He wanted to grow silk. He wanted to manufacture silk. And he did everything he could with his money and everything, built the finest house that anybody had ever seen in the South. He even had a fish pond on top. He had a gravel driveway going up and columns on the side and 2 stories, and he stuccoed it. Now, nobody in East Tennessee had ever heard of stucco. And people would ride by on their boats and their rafts just to look up on the hill to see this white house, stucco, where in the world? And they having a fish pond on top of the house. Well, the Yankees came down. We had the scrimmage in Rotherwood, one-day scrimmage, and guess what they burned down? The first Rotherwood house. Then, again, we had lots of people who lived in there, and when Mrs. Dennis and Mr. Dennis came to live there, and she lived there with them, they got married in 28. She went through there and refurbished. The only thing they didn't get rid of was the slave quarters. And Mama would put the canned food down there, and she said, now, Jilly, you got to go down there and get the canned food, beans or whatever she'd canned. And the stench from the place where the slaves lived, it was just unbearable. And every time it would rain, everything down there was dirt. It was dirt. The cells were dirt, the floor was dirt. The house slaves had the front, and the seat was hewn out of dirt. You could see, and the bars were the window, and the very large dark room behind that room was where the slaves who worked in the fields, that's where they were. Now, we were talking a few minutes ago about there's a certain place in Rotherwood that you stand and the floor moves. It was in Mr. Dennis's den in his library when he allowed me to come into his library. There was a certain place that I would stand in there. All of his books were over here and books right here in the fireplace. And if I'd go to that window, it seemed like the floor would move. Now, I don't think, since Dr. Thibault has bought that house, and it's been remodeled, and there are no evidences at all of slave quarters or anything else there. Whatever it was, a lodestone, and Mr. Stallard and I were talking, who knows, it might have been a cemetery. Now, I'm getting far off now. He told me the story. There's something about cemeteries and the energy that comes from the ground near a cemetery, that it will move twigs. You see him nodding his head? So maybe when Fred Ross was trying to, after the first Rotherwood house burned, and he was trying to get another Rotherwood across the bridge, then he had two houses. There were two houses there. And he tried to put them together. And that was where he, on that knoll, built the Rotherwood house. Of course, the monitors are off, and I forgot my pictures. Mr. Stallard had these pictures enlarged. Oh, let me tell you how Mr. Dennis got Mr. Eastman here in Kingsport. And I'm through. Mr. Eastman said no. You know, he was from Rochester. Had the big color. I brought up a camera. Somebody opened it for me. It has film in it, and I think it's 1941. Okay, so y'all can look at it. But anyway, Mr. Dennis loved to ride. He loved to ride horses. He loved to hunt. All of these were solitary, you know, that he could go and, you know, almost alone, but he felt good out there, and he was a bird. He loved to hunt birds. I was I can't ever think of that place's name, outside of Bristol and between Bristol and Johnson City. Rocky Mount. I was taking some children, some young people, to see that a place there that's a reflection of the good old days and pioneers and everything. And there was this long carriage there next to the log house. And I kept looking at it, and I said, I've seen that carriage somewhere before. But I didn't know, because it had 3 seats and had a seat in front for the driver, and on the back of the long carriage there was a little house, looked like it was a dog house, and then there were racks up under it, and that was Mr. Dennis's That was the carriage, that was the hunting carriage that came from Rotherwood. Now, Clyde was the guy who used to drive. You know, the names are coming to me. Anyway, Clyde was the driver. And Mr. Stallard and I could not, he found somebody, a friend of his, found a picture at J. Fred Johnson's house in the floor when they were cleaning it and gave it to him. And when he came to my house the other week, he said, "Look, Jill, look what I have." There was my daddy standing behind that carriage. My daddy died when I was 9. And to see him standing behind that carriage, we had dogs. There were so many people who worked at Rotherwood. We had people who manned the dogs, who took care of all of the dogs. Mr. Dennis loved the English setters, Irish setters, and they were beautiful, and the spaniels. And when Mr. Eastman came down to look over the river and look over the people and everything, Mr. Dennis and Mr. J. Fred invited him down to Rotherwood. Now, Mrs. Dennis and Mr. Dennis always had formal meals all the time. I brought the little bell that they used to ring for the butler to come. We had finger bowls, all the things. Mr. Dennis's chef sometimes from Oyster Bay would call Mama and say, Mr. Dennis said, "Call you because Mr. Dennis wants oyster Newburgh. Do you know how to make it?" He would give the recipe for Mama so she could make Oyster Bay and make lobster Newburgh and Kingsport, you know. But anyway, when Mr. Eastman saw that hunting board and went on a hunting trip with the friends and the big wigs in Kingsport, Eastman was here. I mean, Rotherwood is just, that's as far as I can go. And I haven't told you about Miss Lola. I haven't told you about the Kingsport Inn, how the women would go there. The only beauty shop in town was at the Kingsport Inn. Now, I'm going to tell you a little something, and I'm through. I told you that my mother and dad were hired by Kingsport Improvement Company. All right, after Mr. Dennis was the president, he was president of everything. He was president of Kingsport Press. You know, Kingsport Press was the largest private book-making company in the world. Mr. Dennis was president of Kingsport Press, so he had to have somebody to come here and run the Kingsport Press because he couldn't run everything that was here. And all of the companies complemented each other. You know, if you had Slipknot over here and you need some belts and stuff, they had a company over here. You know, everybody complimented each other. So the president of Kingsport Press had to have help. My uncle and my auntie got that job. All right, when they built Kingsport Inn, my mother's brother from Stoneacre, Virginia, was the chief bellhop at Kingsport Inn. I can almost stand up on this. You're talking about colored people who knew everything that was going on in Kingsport. On that note, thank you for listening. Thank you. I must close. I really must. But I just, like I said, I'm just so full of joy with being able to go back and pick up. And these names of people I had forgotten, you know, they're coming back. And last year we looked in my yard and I had a mulberry tree. I had a mulberry tree bearing mulberries in my yard. Fred Ross had all kinds of mulberry trees, but he only worked with those that came from China. I don't know where mine came from. We didn't even know it was a mulberry tree. So we took it out to Evergreen because it had a berry on it, and the birds were just flying away, you know, and everything. And at Evergreen, they said, oh, you have a mulberry tree. Isn't that serendipity? Rotherwood. My name is Denny. I was born February 1928. Mr. Dennis got married in 1928. Mr. Dennis was born March the 4th, 1866. Every time Mr. Dennis would leave to go to his other home in Oyster Bay, New York, he never called me Virgelia. He never called me Jill, little girl. When he was ready to leave, Mama would put this big bow on my head. When I went to Douglas School, the kids would line up and laugh. Here comes Bowhead. Daddy would drive up in this big limousine, let me out of the car. They would line up on either side of the walkway, and they'd sing, Big Fat Jill on the windowsill. Oh! And, and I just knew they were going to beat me up. I just didn't know what was going to go on. And tonight, and I'm so glad the girls are here, one of my best friends who decided, I'm going to take care of you. Nobody's going to beat you up. You bring me something every day from home, whatever, and I'll take care of you. Honey, I made sure I brought Helen something. Your mother, I'm talking about your mother. They're here tonight. So anyway, she was the one who saved me from getting beat up every day because I would come to school with a bed. But anyway, Mr. Dennis would come out. I never saw him write a check, never saw money until he got ready to go back to Oyster Bay, New York. He would empty his change. He would bring it and put it on the counter in front of the window and pour it out. No copper. Now, little girl, if you can count that money, you can have it. I got all of his change every time that he would leave to go to Oyster Bay, New York. He said, now you save it, something of that nature. And he always admonished my mother, and don't you bother it. All right, when my dad died, the government came in, took over Rotherwood. Mama moved to Mr. Dennis. Anyway, I had to go to Rogersville to school because I didn't have anybody to drive me to Kingsport schools. So Mama put me in boarding school. That money helped pay for my books and whatever else I had. I worked my tuition. I had a duty. So whatever your duty was, that's what you had to do, and that worked out your tuition. But for my books and whatever else I had to have, my mama did save the money. And I stayed there until I got to the 12th grade and graduated. Folks, thank you for listening. I could just go on. Thank you.